Welcome to the second hour of Jay's analysis. I mentioned that we would discuss classical liberalism, and really what we're talking about here is the history of revolutionary thought. So in the first hour, when I critiqued Dr. Jordan Peterson, boy did I get a flurry of responses from his followers. I think I've had probably 50 fairly angry comments, but most of those comments didn't really deal with the objections that I put forth in the video. And I think that most of these people don't know what classical liberalism is. So when we hear Jordan Peterson identify himself as a classical British liberal, that would be in the tradition of Locke, Bentham, Hume, etc., it's helpful to understand the basics of this position. Now, the revolutionary tradition is not just ideological, it was also socio-political. And so we're talking about a time frame of obviously the 1700s. Now, the revolutionary movements and ideas of that period, they did not come in a vacuum. They actually had a lot of precedents, and particularly ideologies that we want to sort of hone in on as the forebears to this tradition. Now, I mentioned in the first hour William of Ockham and nominalism, and we definitely want to speak a little bit about that, because if we think of William of Ockham, this is really the origin of nominalism most of the time. There are senses in which we could go back to Aristotle for nominalism, but really the essence of this idea in terms of medieval thinkers is William of Ockham. Now, what is the deal here? It's basically a reaction against Platonism. So you do have in the Western Church, especially after Augustine, quite a bit of Platonizing. And I don't think anybody really disputes that. It's pretty clear. There's not a lot of debate about that. And so there's some reaction to that in the church in the West. And that's not to say that either of these sides of the coin is necessarily completely true or false, good or bad. Both sides kind of have their point. But the problem is that as nominalism comes to the fore and as it grows in sway, it will eventually dominate to the point that it undercuts the possibility of any kind of abstract, conceptual, immaterial entities, objects, or notions. And this is where it will lead to, well, atheism, right? That'll become pretty obvious. But for the late medieval period, after the debates of Ockham, where what we get here is kind of the first reaction to the Platonism or the realism of the Western Church. And you would have people at this time debating, for example, the sense in which transubstantiation in the Eucharist happens, and is this possible because of a radical version of realism, that the essences of things can be changed precisely because God more or less holds all these essences in place as they are, and so he can speak a word, the priest speaks a word, and the essence of the bread and the wine changes into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. And the problem is that for nominalism, they noticed a lot of the problems in Platonism and how this didn't really mesh well with the world, because ultimately it's a denial of the world. But their response was an opposite extreme, to say, well, the descriptions that we give of things are merely linguistic. When you talk about the essence of something, you aren't really describing the essence of a thing. You're just using symbols and tokens that are dreamt up sociologically. Things that come out of, just sounds coming out of your mouth, the breath of the mouth, some of the nominalists were said to say. And so there are no universals, there are only particulars, is what this boils down to. All universal categories are problematic because they don't seem to have any real basis in empirical data. When you look at the object, you're not in any way, in this perspective at least, experiencing anything that connects it to any other object. Right? So there's no Platonism allowable here, according to Occam. So over the debates of the Middle Ages, this gets very heated, and you have condemnations sort of thrown back and forth to different thinkers and scholastics and philosophers. But the idea never goes away. It remains there, present in different figures, lurking in the background. I believe in one of the Anselm has a debate with various nominalists, and then you'll also, as you get up into the 13 and 1400s, there's debates with nominalists, and then we'll come to the famous character of Gabriel Bile, and Gabriel Bile is the focus of a famous book by Heiko Oberman called Harvest of Medieval Theology, where he tracks the influence of Gabriel Bile on Luther. Now that's interesting because Luther, you wouldn't think, would be influenced by nominalism, but in fact he is, and that book deals with it extensively. But nominalism served the Reformation well in many ways because it was a means by which different aspects of Roman Catholic dogma could be denied, and particularly something like transubstantiation. So the denial of transubstantiation, aided by things like nominalism, would become an apologetic kind of cornerstone for many apologists in the Reformation tradition. And this would continue on in an ideological stream which would basically say not only is there no basis for something like transubstantiation, if we follow this through, then we actually start deconstructing language itself. We actually start deconstructing the ideas of symbol and referent, right? Word, concept, symbol, referent, and object all matching up in some real way. It's all arbitrary because the words that go beyond merely descriptions of empirical sense data, all of those words are nonsense words. So now you can start to see how we're moving up into not just the Reformation revolutionary period, but actually into the Enlightenment scientific revolution period, where they're really just kind of following suit with the ideas not just of the Reformation, but what's called humanism. And humanism was a movement of guys like John Calvin or Desiderius Erasmus, to return to the original text, to return to the classics, to study the languages, because that would be the real way that we would uncover, the meanings of things, and not through the medium of the papacy and the ancient church fathers and Plato and Aristotle. So this movement to the original sources coincides with a movement to empiricism. Now that's not to say that everybody in this period was a quote empiricist in a David Hume sense or a radical sense, but the movement is going in that direction. We're moving away from contemplation, theoria in the Greek, and away from Platonism and the abstract, the transcendent, the conceptual, and we're stepping towards the idea of the here and the now, the particular, the material, the physical, the directly sensory. Now, this movement then gives rise to what we call the Enlightenment And this is actually a propaganda term that the Enlightenment gave itself. And this is, out of all of these figures, we get an extreme version in the philosophes, right, of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution philosophes, as they're called, wrote the first encyclopedia. So they're known as the encyclopedists. And this would be people like Diderot, people like Voltaire, who in their rabid atheism were very closely connected to things like empiricism. Now, there could be different figures who were influenced by Platonism amongst the revolutionaries, the Jacobins, the Illuminists. I'm not denying that there's a possible influence of Platonism. Certainly amongst the Illuminists, there are many Platonists, because the idea would be that there's a direct perception, a direct seeing of truth outside of any sort of created medium or historical medium of the church. It's man and nature, right? We get this idea in Whitman or the transcendentalists of the American tradition, or the Cambridge Platonists, right? Same idea. So certainly there's a strand that goes in that direction, but for the most part, what we have in the Enlightenment figures and what will become the classical liberal tradition is the predominance of empiricism. And so specifically the British Enlightenment classical liberals would be in the economic realm, people like Adam Smith. It would be people like economic philosophers like David Ricardo. It would be John Locke. It would be people like Immanuel Kant. Kant is in the Enlightenment revolutionary tradition. It would be people like Thomas Reid and common sense philosophy. It would be David Hume. Obviously, all of the French revolutionary figures would all fit into this as well. Isaac Newton, right, the Newtonian worldview. So all of this roughly could be classed in the very broad umbrella of the liberal tradition. Right? And this also includes the American founding fathers, the Jeffersons, the Franklins, and if we want to place them in an ideological tree, we can put the Illuminists of the French Revolution, as I've pointed out many times. The Jacobins, they're the radical communist Marxists, as they will eventually be known. They're the left version of the revolutionaries during this time frame, the 1700s. The American founding fathers tended to be the right-wing revolutionaries, who were called Girondins. So you have the Jacobins and the Girondins. But both branches of this revolutionary tradition are liberal. And that's what most people don't understand. Now, I didn't understand any of that really until I took some very in-depth undergraduate, graduate level classes on the French Revolution. So I got a very deep look at this time frame. And certainly there were big bankers behind Protestant, Jewish, Swedish banking houses actually behind the French Revolution. And of course Quigley covers that. We've discussed it before. And that's because this would aid various both Jewish and Protestant banking interests in getting rid of Catholic monarchy in France. So there was a vested interest there. And at the same time, there are ideological shifts that are occurring throughout Europe, throughout the Western world at the same time, that shifts man's view away from the abstract, away from the idea of theoria, contemplation, and towards the here and the now. And this is why we have a revolutionary tradition. So it's important to understand, I think, that all of these successive movements, people in these centuries, right, late 1400s all the way up, it's almost a kind of working out of a logic problem in a way. This is kind of how I view it. is that you have people believing certain things, putting out certain ideas, and it might take centuries actually for these ideas to kind of work themselves out to their logical conclusions. And that, of course, is why we've seen such a radical shift in the ideologies of the West in the last few hundred years, going from late medieval Roman Catholicism to Protestant schisms, various Protestant sects, to the evangelical schisms, to Freemasonry, to atheism and deism, to postmodernism, right? All of Darwinism, etc. All the ideologies that have captivated the West really are the outworkings of several centuries of dialectical problems. And that's what no one in the mainline intellectual sphere can really grasp. Certainly, someone like Alex Jones or Jordan Peterson makes a lot of good points, and if they're arguing with some social justice warrior, it makes for good entertainment, but you're not really getting solid meat there. You're getting just a kind of right-wing liberal reaction to a left-wing liberal reaction. And so the modern social justice warrior is really just kind of the end result of this several centuries long stages of revolution. And I'm not the only person to think that way. There are many people who have written on the history of dialectics who critique it. Many people who think that the dialectics are good. Right? The Marxist tradition sees dialectics as just a manifestation of Darwinian struggle and progress. Orthodox theologians for many, many centuries have critiqued dialectics, all the way back to St. Gregory Palamas telling Barlaam, the Western theologian, that the errors of Western theology would lead to atheism, and it did. Right? All these critiques of dialectics back to St. Maximus the Confessor critiquing dialectics in his debate with Pyrrhus. Now, these dialectics and the overarching difficulties of the problems of the West and the history of ideas, I believe this is lost on people like Jordan Peterson, Stefan Molyneux, and these kind of pop figures. So that's the essence of my critique, is that while Jordan Peterson can be correct in arguing this or that specific point, he's not correct in trying to fall back on something that's a mishmash of a bunch of modern nonsense. Right? You can't mix Freud, the Bible, Carl Jung, and Jeremy Bentham and John Locke and David Hume. Like this is the stupidest mishmash of positions imaginable. Like I can't even. I mean, the only way that you can mishmash all these is precisely because you're a modern liberal, because liberalism in its essence, and I'm speaking of all of them for the past 500 years, all of the classical liberal ideas are ultimately relativistic. That's the essence here. So the easiest way to the best book that's, 150, 200 pages would be Father Seraphim Rose's book Nihilism. That's what I would tell Jordan Peterson to read. Here's an easy book that's 150, 200 pages. Read that. Now, there's nothing wrong with science. There's nothing inherently flawed about science, or I'm not anti-science. I'm not a Luddite or anything ridiculous like that. And I don't think anybody who listens to this podcast or to Jay's analysis would think that. But some of the commenters, of course, that are new, that were mad at some of the criticisms I had for Jordan Peterson, don't understand that. And certainly Jordan Peterson can also be critiqued. I didn't even launch into a critique of his just blank acceptance of Darwinian theory with absolutely there's no criticism on his part of Darwinian theory, just blindly adopts it. I didn't even criticize that, but obviously that's just another manifestation of liberal worldview, another attempt at some grand narrative. And this is what's amazing about all the the classical liberal perspectives is that they all are attempting to have grand narratives. Kant has a grand plan for German idealism, his version of it. Locke has this idea of the grand scheme of governments revolutionizing to become, constitutional monarchies or people governed nation states. Who else? Descartes sees his version of idealism as revolutionary. In other words, what I'm saying is that the revolution, in all of its various flavors and forms, in any of these different thinkers, takes on the character of a grand narrative. Now, I'm offering actually a postmodern critique here. I'm not saying postmodernism is true, but I'm saying the postmodernists all make this criticism of the revolutionary idealists of any flavor. It doesn't matter. And they're right to make this criticism, because how do you, on the one hand, start with relativistic bases and presuppositions and then try to come up with a new grand narrative scheme of how everything's going to be fixed? Some form of utopianism, or some form of how we're going to perfect man. We're going to, figure everything out under the aegis of evolution, or everything comes under the aegis of chemistry, right? Which grew out of alchemy, biology, right? I mean, all of these different revolutionary schemes are summed up in what Aldous Huxley says in Brave New World, which he says is the pinnacle, the climax of all the revolutions. He says all the revolutions, back to the Enlightenment, Scientific Revolution, French Revolution, American Revolution, he says they're all leading to Brave New World. And that was the plan all along. You don't ever hear any of the classical liberals tell you that, do you? But what is the essence of what I'm saying? The essence of what I'm saying is that 1776 is 1789 is 1984. That's the essence of my critique. So Jordan Peterson's worldview is what gave rise to the very social justice warrior lunatics that he attempts to refute and argue against. It's just another flavor of Masonic revolutionary ideology. I mean, the radical Jacobin revolutionaries were so crazy that they were back then doing tranny stuff and, having crazy orgies and acting like lunatics and thinking that the women were wearing beards. Literally. That's the origin of the radical revolutionary tradition of modernity. And their faux counterparts, their Masonic brethren, the Jeffersons, right, the Franklins, these characters, they're not real opposition. They might have opposition on private property or something like this, or how you define a gender nowadays or something, but they're not a real opposition, because they both come from the same starting point of relativism. Now, some of these characters like Molyneux or somebody like that, or even Jordan Peterson, he might not say he's a relativist. Okay, so I'm not trying to attribute a false position to him where I'm saying, oh, Jordan Peterson is a moral relativist. He may not be, but I'm saying that sometimes he contradicts himself, like in the statement that I pointed out, where in the Channel 4 interview he says, I will not accept the state's mandate to use 60 gender pronouns, but when a trans person wants me to call them a she, I will do it. Well, who cares whether it's the state or just some random person? The whole point of it is what's objectively true and factual. It doesn't matter whether, like, the source of the lie is not the issue. It's the lie that's the issue. And it is a lie to call a woman a man. So Jordan Peterson saying that he will not concede his the use of pronouns to radical liberals directly contradicts his statement that he will concede the use of pronouns to the radical liberal individual who requests to be called a different gender. So I've had probably 50 people message me and comment to me that, oh, he was talking about the state mandate and the law. I don't care. It doesn't matter. That's not the point. The point is the truthfulness or the falsehood of the claim itself. That's the point. So yes, he wants to frame it like, oh, it's me against the tyrannical state, and I'm the, liberal free individual. But the liberal free individual is classical liberalism and is the dialectical opposite of collectivism. You see, this is again Jacobins versus Girondins. The Jacobins were the collectivists. The Girondins are the individualists. So do you want to be Robespierre or do you want to be Ben Franklin? Do you want to chop off the heads of 20,000 people a day? Or do you want to have sex with a bunch of 80-year-old women? I'm not kidding, by the way. That's actually something Ben Franklin talked about that. He said that having sex with grannies was the best because they had the most experience. So he's at the Hellfire Club with satanic grannies, I guess. I don't know, but that is what he says. And I also don't buy that they were really that distinct. I mean, the French revolutionaries were the BFFs of the American revolutionaries. So, Lafayette and Robespierre and all these characters are they're the minutia distinctions that they have and differences over things like private property doesn't really matter if they're all hanging out at the same Masonic lodge, and they were. So America, this is why I critique Americanism. America is the production of the classical liberal tradition. America is the manifestation of the right-wing revolutionary tradition. This is why I don't understand. I mean, I don't mind people trying to make America into a Christian nation because I understand it. I used to do that when I was 19, 20, 21. I believed all the Christian BS, evangelical crap about America. And then you realize that it's a mishmash of incoherent ideas and they don't know what they're talking about. Now, let me rephrase that. Many of the founding fathers were very intelligent men. And yes, they were drawing on a whole bunch of different famous political documents, everything from Machiavelli to the Italian republics and their constitutions to Roman law to biblical law to Mosaic law. I understand that, and I know about the Federalist Papers and all that. But what I'm saying is that you get this basic presupposition in the American ideology and in its essential documents that the God that we're starting with or giving credence here, this so-called creator, is really any kind of theism we want. It's a generic theism. It's Masonic theism. And it was done that way on purpose to allow religious pluralism. I mean, it's a founding document of religious pluralism. And that's the problem, is because, again, maybe you like that, maybe you want that, but if you believe in the Christianity of the last 2,000 years, and then, of course, the revelation of the way God wanted things, for example, with Moses, God doesn't tolerate every other religion. He doesn't tolerate all different positions. So in other words, this ideology starts with the transcendent, but it starts with a relativized transcendent. So that means basically a pointless transcendent. Essentially deism. Deism is atheism because it's a pointless God. It doesn't mean anything other than it's a placeholder, right? It's God in name only. Thus, the American scheme, the American superstructure is built on this beginning founding maxim of there being no absolute, clear, transcendent truth, only something generic that can have anything pasted into it. And in many ways, really, it's very parallel to Rome. America is in many ways similar to the Roman Imperium. And I'm speaking here of the pagan Roman Imperium, because the way the pagan Roman Imperium functioned was that you could be a part of the Pax Romana as long as you could have your cult, but your cult had to be subservient to Caesar. Right? So as long as you paid Caesar obeisance, you could worship Mithra cult, you could be the Sibyl cult, you could be pagan animism, you could worship the Greek god, doesn't matter. But you have to, put Caesar as the ultimate deity. Well, what's happened in the American experience? Well, we don't have Caesar. We just have some generic placeholder instead, which is an idol, some other thing, some unknowable, unknown God, right? Like Paul in Acts 17, when he's like, I walked around your city, Greeks, and I noticed you even have an idol to the unknown God. He says, that's the God that I proclaim to you, the one that you don't know. So in the same way, it's kind of like that in America. America is like this analog of ancient Rome that provides this global pax, supposedly. But it's ultimately centered around a fiction, the noble lie of Plato, because its bases are atheistic. Now, on top of that, yes, you get a lot of Christian-influenced principles, private property, respect for life, this kind of stuff. Sure, okay, that's fine. But the point is that we've got two conflicting starting points. And there's no respect for life without the idea of being made in God's image. There's no purely human, secular, humanistic basis for respect for life or dignity. I mean, if it's just Darwinian evolution, nature is predator and prey. I don't have to respect your life. Why should I? Get out of my way. Give me your stuff. Right? Make me God, Emperor of the world. You can't escape ideologies, and this is another nonsensical thing that Jordan Peterson was falling back on, was the idea that he says, I'm an American pragmatist, and that's how that's my metaphysic, and he's either very dense when it comes to philosophy, or he's being ironic there, because there's no position that's more anti-metaphysical than American pragmatism. So, American pragmatism is a great example of the very things that I'm talking about. Not only is it relativistic, it's really just crossed out any kind of question like that and views it as basically kryptonite. It doesn't want anything to do with these kinds of serious philosophical questions, because it just thinks they're pointless and unanswerable, and really the only thing that matters is, again, pragmatism, right? So this is an even worse form of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism at least tried to come up with how there could be universal rights and wrongs, but pragmatism is even worse. And what would you expect from a completely capitalist, Masonic nation, America, right? What is the only philosophical school that it could develop? Pragmatism. So, all of this, the whole modern world, this is the essence of it, goes back to the harvest of medieval theology in terms of nominalism. And yeah, there are some Platonists. There was some Platonist influence, but I don't think that anybody would say that we're going up against global Platonism. We're not. We're going up against total empiricism. I mean, the world could have taken a different track. It could have gone down some sort of weird Platonic perspective, and who knows how things would have gone. I mean, in ways, the West did go down a Platonic perspective with the filioque, but that's a different topic. Maybe we'll get into that with Nick. But what I'm saying is that the trek that we took, especially after the Enlightenment and then the subsequent revolutions, was the empirical turn, the turn towards the immediate, the here and the now, and the sense state of the material, the solid, the physical. And it's led us to nihilism. And that is the essence of Father Seraphim Rose's book, which we will cover soon. But the reason I'm bringing it up in relationship to the papacy and the schism between the East and the West and the debate that I'll be having with Nick is precisely because it was the adoption of the dialectical assumptions of Augustinianism and of the Greek doctrines of simplicity and essentialism and Hellenism that, in our view, led to the problems in the West. That's not to say there aren't problems in the East and haven't been. Obviously there have been. But the conceptions of life, man, nature, God, creation, end times, no one would admit that the East underwent the kinds of revolutions that the West did. And then the West exported all of that revolutionary garbage to the rest of the world. So we can hear all day about the, Russia spreading her errors to the rest of the world. But I want to hear about the Enlightenment spreading its errors to the rest of the world. I want to hear about, this is like supposedly what Fatima says, right? I want to hear about England spreading her Marxism to the rest of the world. I want to know about nominalism spreading empiricism to the rest of the world, right? The British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, spreading their monetarism, their rapacious capitalism to the rest of the world, right? Spreading their opium and drugs to the rest of the world. What about those things, right? How is it that it's all Russia spreading her errors, according to Fatima? What about all these other things, right? Bolshevism comes from the Warburgs, right? And Trotsky and New York bankers sending gold to fund those revolutionaries. Why didn't Our Lady tell us about that? Well, that's because I don't believe that that's a legitimate revelation from God. But it works well for geopolitics and mobilizing the West to fight a phony opponent of, quote, Russians, when it's not, quote, Russians, it's revolutionaries. The whole battle of everybody in the world, the last 500 years, is with these revolutionaries. And these revolutionaries, and notice, I don't mean just Marxist. I mean all of them. I want Locke in there. Throw him in this bottomless pit. Throw David Hume in this bottomless pit. Throw Gabriel Bile and William of Ockham in the same pit of these revolutionaries with Voltaire and Diderot. Throw Jefferson and Franklin in there. All of them. Right? All the way up to Darwin, Freud. Everybody that Jordan Peterson likes, throw in this bottomless pit of revolutionary garbage and dysentery, and the world will be a lot better place. But of course, this revolution, how has it spread? Because of the money power behind it. The money power, the usury power, the banksters, not just for 100 years, but for hundreds of years, have loved the revolutionary fervor. Why? Because it's a wrecking ball. Because it's a great way to do power politics and psychological warfare strategy of tension. Right? It's an ancient technique. Just give it different names. If you want, let's say you got a village. You got a rival village. You want the resources of the rival village. But your rival village has a fairly competent ruler. So you've got a challenge. How are you going to topple that guy and maybe put somebody in who's your buddy? Well, here's what you would do. We would go into his city. We would send in some spies, and we would find out who doesn't like this guy, right? The leader of the rival village. And when we get some intel, we get some info, we're going to find out what would be the best way to not immediately topple him, but what we want to do is kind of start spreading rumors, start spreading gossip, and really agitate. Right? So this is our agitation phase. We're going to start pumping in some money to some people that don't like this guy. So we're going to start forming little meetups, little organizations to get together to talk about voicing their opinions of why they don't like this guy. Now, if he tries to clamp down on the town hall meetings about his abuses or whatever, well, you just shout all the louder about how he's a tyrant. Now we also might spread some other rumors and lies and get him all flustered. And then what we're going to do is, again, we're not going to immediately fund a revolution. We're just going to keep agitating until he's forced to deal with it, and we're going to try to make him deal with it in a way that he looks bad. And so then eventually we're going to just outright fund the toppling and the revolution. And maybe the leader of the revolution is a buddy of yours that you've sent in there, and you've given him the money, and you've made the deal that when he comes to power, the deal was, he's going to give half of the village resources to you. Right? So this is just a basic little model here of this is what's been happening for hundreds of years. And the strategists behind this are people who are not committed necessarily to any ideology or place, but it's people who are committed to international capital, international banking, monetarism, usury, etc., etc. So that's how the world has reached this extreme state of the whole world almost adopting relativism. Who would have ever thought, 800 years ago, when no one, except maybe some very superstitious person or one or two radical intellectuals at some university, nobody would have been a relativist. And then a few hundred years later, the entire world has adopted the relativism of modernity. Why? Well, because it's been so effective through internationalism, global capitalism, and the education system. And the propaganda that we've been given from the Royal Society especially. In fact, that book on the history of the Royal Society, Freemasonry and the Royal Society, that book is at pains to say many times over that the scientific revolution brought relativism to the world. No longer will we have essences in metaphysics. The liberal tradition will give us the freedom of relativism, except, see, here's the sad thing. Relativism is a prism. Relativism is a prison. It's not freedom. It doesn't give you what it promises you. It locks you into being a slave to dialectics, to the state, to the bankers, to the corporate system, to whatever. It doesn't matter when you're a relativist, because you don't have anything to ground you. You don't have any position, a strong stance from which to operate, to have a way to delineate true from false, right from wrong. You're blinded by doublethink. You're mind bombed. You can't. And these people, the SJWs, people who think that they're different genders, 60 genders, that they're animals. This is the most extreme present day version of this double bind, this doublethink, this hoodwink. And the essence of all this, again, is that Jordan Peterson, Milo, Alex Jones, who else? Stefan, right? They're all part of the liberal tradition. They constantly say it. I'm not being unfair to them. They talk about it almost every day. Whenever they open their mouths, they're talking about classical liberalism, which is a stupid, retarded position. It's completely indefensible and incoherent. It's not hard to figure out that relativism is false, and all these positions are relativistic. Relativism is self-refuting. That's all they'd have to figure out. Like, if they could just get to that point, but see, this would require, quite a bit of change. This might require changing one's life, because then it starts to mean I can't determine right and wrong for myself. I actually have to submit to objective exterior standards of right and wrong, namely God's law, right? That's where this leads, and that's the real root of why people don't toss away their relativism, why they cling to it, because it's egoism. It's the passions, it's the essence of the fall. Satan said, you'll be your own God. You can determine right and wrong, good and evil. That's the lie. Relativism is the result of the fall. I'm my own God. I decide what I want. I decide what's true and false. Just whatever you want, man. Give me whatever I want. You can have whatever you want. That is the classical liberal. That's what they're always saying. You have your freedom. You have your butt sex. As long as I can have mine. Oh my gosh. Anyway. We can't mix oil and water. We can't combine atheism and Christianity to have America. We can't combine Benjamin Franklin and Jesus to have Jordan Peterson's Bible lectures. I mean, it's just like loony land, right? So I don't dislike him as a person. Maybe he's on a trek where he's working these positions out on his own, and he'll end up in agreement with me. Who knows? Anything is possible. But as it is now, the things that I hear the classical liberals tout and preach every single day, it's just a rehash of relativism. It's just a rehash of the problems of Western dialectics. And again, hopefully this will come to the fore in the Nick Fuentes debate as we get into the more obscure esoteric aspects of this through the Western view of God as opposed to the Orthodox view, and the rise of the papal monarchy, particularly after the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, right? Even to the point of 3 different popes at one time claiming to be pope, and one of them being in a giant French palace at Avignon. Total craziness breaks out in the Middle Ages. Middle Ages are great, by the way. This has all been hidden from you on purpose. You've really been cheated if you don't know the Middle Ages, because it's a very fascinating time period. It wasn't the Dark Ages that was invented by Voltaire to cast aspersion on this period. And nobody in the West knows about Byzantium. This is like the hidden kingdom, and it's hidden on purpose. I'm more and more convinced that all of these kinds of things they suppress the church fathers in academia. They suppress Byzantium. They don't want you to know that these things existed. They built giant, beautiful cathedrals. There were Christian civilizations. There was Christendom. You're not supposed to know any of that. You're just supposed to think that there was Plato and Aristotle, and then it jumps to Descartes. Quite literally, that's what most university education models do in philosophy or in history or whatever. So you've been listening to Jay's analysis. We will, again, as I said, we will return to the globalist books, but I couldn't pass up a critique of Jordan Peterson after 100 plus messages about Jordan Peterson. So that's what I think of Jordan Peterson, and we've got to leave the liberal tradition. All of it. The whole thing has to be scrapped. Just as by the way, this should be, they even have to admit this. Like, if they were consistent, this is Dugin's point. Like, the liberal tradition is all about scrapping everything from the past and starting over. Well, doesn't that mean that we could scrap the liberal tradition and start over? Well, if they're consistent, then yes, and that's a postmodern kind of critique of them. But anyway, they're not ever going to give up their position, because it's a religious dogma that they're committed to, just like Darwinism. So there has to be a kind of conversion. So hopefully we can pray for Jordan Peterson to grow out of classical liberalism. But I would imagine a lot of that speaking money and a lot of that book money will dry up if you step out of the classical liberal dialectic. So next time we'll hopefully return to Globalist book series. I think we should be moving on to either another H.G. Wells book or the Jacques Attali book, but we'll see. Thank you for listening.